Welcome back to another edition of the Mintcast, podcast hosted by Mint Press News. We're going behind the headlines and diving into the biggest issues of the day. I'm your host this week, Alan McLeod. Now, it's been almost 2 months since the Hamas surprise attack and the Israeli assault on Palestine. And that doesn't really seem like there's any signs that the assault is going to let up anytime soon. The entertainment world has taken sides in this issue. More than 700 celebrities signed an open letter pledging support to the government of Israel. On the other hand, the hip-hop community has shown a lot of solidarity with Palestine, with over 600 artists joining the Musicians for Palestine movement. I'm happy to say that joining me today to talk about all things Israel-Palestine, the music industry, and politics more generally is a legend of the hip-hop world. Immortal Technique is an independent rapper and activist widely regarded as one of the most respected and gifted artists of his generation. But before we get into that, if you'd like the show and you want to see it grow, please do consider supporting us financially on Patreon. There'll be a link in the description of wherever you're watching this or listening to this. And if you're in a position to help financially, if you're not, in a position to help financially, you can still help us by liking and sharing this content with your friends and colleagues. So, Immortal Technique, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on the show, sir.
The pleasure is all mine. So, Tech, I'm very happy to be talking with you finally, but I wish we could do things. I wish we could be talking in a bit more of a happier time. Right now, Israel is continuing to pound Gaza into rubble as we speak. Could I first get your response to what's going on in the Middle East right now? I know you've been very vocal about it.
I see it as a continuation of the political aspirations of not just the United States, but NATO, and by default, Israel. I think that there are some beliefs that need to be challenged among revolutionaries and the left, and one of them is the idea that, and it bears repeating, that it bears similarity to some anti-Semitic tropes, that hiding behind America are Jewish people that are pulling all of the strings, when in reality, it's the United States of America that's pulling the strings for Israel. The United States uses the government of Israel to do the type of things that it can't do. And I'll give you one example to the listeners that you have. We as the United States backed Saddam Hussein in his war against Iran. But when documents were released not too long ago, it revealed that we didn't want Saddam Hussein to win. We wanted these two entities to destroy each other. So at the time when we were backing Saddam Hussein to fight Iran, we had previous knowledge and previous intel that they had bought a nuclear reactor from France. And since we couldn't destroy their nuclear reactor, the evidence has become clear that we asked Israel, hey, here's the location of the nuclear reactor. Here it is. Can you hit that for us? The United States just can't bomb Syria whenever it wants. It has to have some excuse. It has to talk to Congress. People know who did it, but there is no balance of power that would hold Israel in the same regard. In other words, it's able to do the things that the United States can't do. But I think that what's become very clear to people that are watching, and especially even to the Israelis, even there are people that are watching this show that don't like Palestine, that are Zionists, they have to admit something. The United States can't really protect Israel. It can only sell them weapons to brutalize their neighbors or sell them a shield. But what it can't actually do is go to Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran and say, hey, you need to stop. The only other people that have the power to do that would be a coalition of Russia and China. And since the United States is not interested in a triumvirate to rule the world, it wants to be the singular top power. That's why that hasn't happened. For example, they could have stopped that monstrous war in Yemen that cost the lives of 1 million children whenever they wanted to. But ironically and sadly, it became China who stepped in and scooped them and said, oh, I'll put the Saudi and the Iranian ambassador here, and we can stop famine and starvation and misery that you people were using as a political objective. So I think what's clear is that this is par for the course. Death and murder for the political objectives of the United States, right? The Ukrainian people would be horrified if they heard Americans speak the way they do in the halls of Congress and say, hey, we wanted a political objective. Grind down the Russian military. Oh my God. So you used me and my people You use the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. And this doesn't, I'm not saying that there aren't other parties to blame here, but I think that what's evident is that this is part of a much larger strategy. And we can get into the details of what that strategy is.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's such an important point you're raising. I think it's very important to see Israel not as the tail wagging the dog, but really as an extension of US power. It's like the lieutenant, the cop on the beat in the Middle East, right? It's almost like the 51st state. And as you said, Israel often does the dirty work that the Americans don't want to do in public anyway. I'm thinking of things like helping the far right government, the fascist dictatorship of Chile under Augusto Pinochet, sending him weapons, resupplying um, his Air Force, for example, or helping the apartheid government in South Africa, or just generally being the cop in the Middle East who goes around bashing heads so that the oil of the Middle East can continue to be controlled by Western companies, specifically American ones.
And I would add that that's not relegated to one theater of war or even one particular faith. I mean, even in the case of supporting Mujahideen fighters or jihadists, it's been very clear. And look, you're not arguing with me, the people who disagree. You're arguing with history. Israel was a key factor in bringing Soviet-style weapons to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. That's not a rumor. That's not a myth. That's actually true. They didn't want American-made weapons there first because it would be too obvious about who was supplying these fighters. So Israel became the middleman in many of these situations to get those weapons there, which raises another question, that if we want to stop Islamic terrorism around the world, you don't have to go to a cave in Afghanistan or a hut in Saudi Arabia. You need to go down to Langley in Virginia to CIA headquarters and say, stop sponsoring these people and using them as political pawns, because eventually you're not going to be able to just kill the pieces you have on the board after your objective with them is finished. And there's actual blowback from that you keep the American people ignorant about. And I think that ignorance is where we dwell now. I'm a person who doesn't like to see innocent people hurt. So when I saw a picture of a Russian tank rolling over an 80-year-old Ukrainian man, I was disgusted by this. But then I asked myself a question. As hurt and sickened as I am by this, why haven't you shown me any of the children that were blown up in the Donbass? Why didn't you show me a single person that was tortured to death in Iraq and Afghanistan? Why didn't you show me the bodies of the children hit by drones? It's because you use the death of children as a political football, U.S. media. You use the safety of children on the border as a political football. But the reality is that when it comes to achieving a goal, it doesn't matter who gets hurt. The purpose and the perspective of the media is simply to influence the position that we have now, like an American Pravda. We're past even the facade of yellow journalism. It's come to the point where we've recognized that there are rich people who control media outlets and would like to change your mind about things. That's what they're paying for. They're paying for the idea that they can change the mind of the 10th man. That's an old saying. What the 10th man believes, other men will believe. And it's rooted in kind of this dark Roman history of decimation, where if cowardice was detected in the legion and they ran, they would line soldiers up on a bridge, and every 10 men they would shove off. Why? Because we're trying to rid ourselves of that 10% of people who refuse to go along with what the regular story is. They see those individuals as toxic to whatever it is. But we're not talking about cowardice in a Roman legion. We're talking about people with the bravery to discuss maybe a complete opposite of what the narrative that the United States is showing to people, that one side is full of godless terrorists and the other people are innocent settlers that showed up the way pilgrims did. And I think I'll just close this part of the section by saying that when you compare October 7th to 9/11, I saw that happening after October 7th. And I thought it was a silly comparison. And now I think it's a perfect comparison. And I'll explain why in less than a minute. Because after 9/11, everybody was empathetic with the United States. Even people who didn't like us said, oh, Jesus, this is horrible. People jumping out of windows to escape a fire, little kids having debris falling on them. And then our response of killing 1 million Afghans and 300,000 Iraqis took all the credibility that America had in that part of the world, rolled it up into a proverbial blunt of the ashes of people and smoked it. And unfortunately, that same thing has happened on October 7th. You had an attack in which the entire world and even most of the Arab world was empathetic, where even at that time before that attack took place, Hamas had not much more than a 20% favorability rate, a little bit higher than Joe Biden. And I think the reality is that after the sickness and the massacres and the deaths of, 15,000 people and almost 9,000 of them being children, no one believes the IDF anymore. No one believes anything that they have to say, especially with the stories about 40 beheaded babies and all these other things. And now they're in a position where they're permanently on the back foot and they've lost something that you can't buy, which is the credibility of the international community.
Most definitely. I mean, there was a study that came out pretty recently from Brown University, their Cost of War project, that found that America's post 9/11 wars of imperialism have caused the death of 6 million people worldwide. And even more startlingly, they added a conservative figure of 37 million people displaced, forced to leave their homes because of the bombings, because of the invasions, and because of the just general destruction to society. This is just a gigantic number. And you're going back talking about what you were talking about in the media. We don't see the victims. We don't see the people who are actually hit by these Raytheon weapons. We might see, Northrop Grumman or Boeing or whoever is making these things. We might see them dropping from the planes, but we never see the destruction. We never see the screaming women, the weeping children, seeing their relatives being blown up, their buildings, their villages, their towns being destroyed. And maybe during this last few weeks, we've seen a little bit of that if you're on social media. If you're relying on corporate media, you probably haven't seen those images. But maybe if you're on TikTok or Twitter or wherever, you might have seen these things. But honestly, this has been going on for many decades, not just across the Middle East, but in Palestine specifically. And one thing I've appreciated about what you've been doing is that you've been using your platforms to really educate people about the history and the reality of the situation in Palestine. There is a viral clip of you talking in New York City recently when you were discussing with a megaphone in your hand. You were saying this war did not actually start on October 7th. It's been going on for many, many decades.
I just want to remind the people that are watching from around the world, this war did not start yesterday. It did not start 2 days ago. It didn't start 3 days ago. It started 75 years ago, ladies and gentlemen. People have been living under occupation for 75 years. Everybody in this crowd hates to see children die. They hate to see people get raped and killed. But now they want to talk about that. They didn't want to talk about that 2 weeks ago. They didn't want to talk about that a month ago. They didn't want to talk about that a year ago. And they have been erasing that history for 75 years, ladies and gentlemen.
So, yeah, why have you felt the need to do so much? And what do you think the basic framework of understanding this violence should be?
I think it should never be framed as a religious conflict. One, because that discounts the millions of Palestinian Christians, and it also discounts the millions of Jewish people that are against the occupation, and even the people in Israel that are against the Bibi Netanyahu government. The other thing that I think is important is that we have to go back to the very beginning and discuss why Zionism was created. You see, I think that those two things have been conflagrated purposefully by the Israeli government to escape any sort of critique and push all critiques of Israel towards the impression that they all are rooted in anti-Semitism. And the reality is that Zionism was created as a response to European anti-Semitism, not to a violent interaction with Arab people. Now, no one's going to say that Jews and Arabs lived in perfect peace, but they lived in relative peace in Palestine. And I think that Zionists hate that idea. They want to recreate it as if the Holocaust 2.0 was happening in Palestine, when that's really not the case. I think what is damning to that is if you ask people about ethnic cleansing and they deny it, they're not really arguing with me. They're arguing with the letters of Ben-Gurion. They're arguing with the founders of Israel, who had no shame writing about how 2 million Arab people had to be displaced by whatever means. These aren't my words. These are their words. These people are arguing with their own statues and saying, hey, the Confederacy wasn't fought over slaves. Okay, well, let's go ask the president of the Confederacy why they had a revolution here in the United States. Oh, you don't believe that we displaced people in Israel? Sure, let's go ask the founders of Israel if they needed to displace people. I think that's where we fall in line with this. And whereas we see Theodor Herzl as the father of Zionism, he was really heavily influenced by a man called Moses Hess, who wrote a book called Rome and Jerusalem, which I suggest if people haven't read, they go and read, because the idea of Israel was not firstly conceived as, oh, we're going to take this in the Holy Land. No, it was we need a homeland, period, because we keep getting attacked again and again here in Europe. We're not wanted here. And white people know who's white and who's not white. That's where this saying comes from. Oh, hey, they know who's white and who's not white, and you're not white. You're Jewish, and we want you out of this neighborhood. So if you look at not just pogroms in Russia, but you look at the Alhambra decree, and you look at literally 2 or 3 dozen displacements and the expulsion of Jewish people throughout not just the Middle Ages, but the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, I think that it's pretty clear that the people were abused and tortured in Europe, and so they invented an ideology where they could be secure somewhere else. But the mythology doesn't end there. The mythology actually metamorphosizes there, because then it becomes, oh, a land without a people for a people without a land. And I think that that's fundamentally wrong. But it takes us back to the original point that Arabs and Jews and Hebrew people and Muslims have never been natural enemies of each other. They died side by side when the Crusaders invaded Jerusalem. They have been living amongst each other for years. The Mizrahi Arabs needed to leave where they were from because of the machinations of Israel. They wanted to make things as uncomfortable for them in their own land so that they would leave the areas of Arab countries that they're rich and come to Israel in not just a brain drain, but the ability to say, no, you're not wanted among those people. Well, why aren't you wanted? Because we've created a situation where we've exacerbated the idea that we really hate each other, instead of saying, well, wait a minute, who's caused all the pogroms? Who's caused all these expulsions? Who actually had a Holocaust? It wasn't us. It was these European people. And now we're being painted as if, the Palestinian people are being painted as if they're the ones that conceived the final solution. And you even have American Zionists trying to rewrite history. Oh, Hitler was influenced by the Mufti of Jerusalem. No, he was influenced by Leopold. He was influenced by the massacres in Armenia. That's what he was influenced by. He spoke about that openly. He said, hey, man, if they're not going to notice that many African people dead, if they don't notice the Armenians, right? He was influenced by the United States of America when he looked at the genocide of Native Americans, right? Which here there are still conservative factions fighting that idea that there was a genocide of Native Americans. So I'm through trying to debate history with people that are morally bankrupt. I just present their own sword to them to fall on. And it's given me more success than any political argument that I've ever had before in my life, because they're really arguing with their own heroes, right? Oh, man, I'm from the cult of Hercules. Well, let's read Hercules' diary. He said that we should just kill women and children. Wonderful cult you belong to there. So, I mean, this is what I'm dealing with. And I have no fear of speaking on these things or whatever the consequences may be, because they're not rooted in anything even resembling anti-Semitism. The first part of our discussion was how Israel could get the security that it really wants, that it can't get from the United States anymore, right? They can only sell them a shield, a surface-to-air missile battery, the Iron Dome. They can't stop missiles and bombs from coming from other places. That's what they would need Russia and China to reach out to create a diplomatic solution to do. Those are the only people that can guarantee safety. And now I think the Israelis are becoming aware of that. Too late, unfortunately, but.
Yeah, I mean, if you look back in centuries of history, as you said, the sort of natural enemy of the Jewish people has not really been Muslims, not their fellow Semites. It's been imperialistic white Europeans who have consistently oppressed them and attacked them over the centuries of struggles, from, as you said, the Crusades to the many, many expulsions of the Jews out of Europe from, 1290 in England, or 1492 in Spain, or 1497 in Portugal, or just it seems like dozens of times out of Germany over the years. And this goes on to the pogroms of the late 19th and early 20th century, right through the Holocaust of the mid 20th century. So when you say maybe they were people without a land, but the land they went to certainly was not without people before then. And that's really the sticking point of this whole issue, is that they tried to build a state on top of another pre-existing state. I want to switch gears slightly here. As I said in the intro, there seems to be a lot of pressure right now on musicians in the industry to take sides or have some sort of opinion on this. But what I'm sensing is that most of the pressure to support Israel anyway is coming from the top down. Would you agree with that? What's going on in the industry?
I would say you're partially right. It's the top down, but um, it's also, I think, related to what people's, I'm thinking of the right way to say it, to what people's personal biases are and how they were raised. So that doesn't necessarily come just from the top. There are several people that may not be the top producers or artists, but they're empathetic because of the way that they were raised for one side or another. I think that's where I differentiate. I grew up around Jewish people, around Muslims. I grew up around people of so many different faiths, and I didn't have a bias when I first came into this. I mean, if I probably had a bias, it was probably for Israel, because I grew up, in a very strict Catholic household, which is like, oh, this is what's going on. We have to support, the people who follow God and the people who hold the holy sites. And later on, you start to realize, well, there's a tier justice system here. This isn't correct. If anyone else was living like this, it would be horrible. And then there are even things that activists say that I started to question, like when they call Gaza an open air prison. And I say, well, wait a minute. I don't even think that's correct, because, if you're going to go to prison, it requires due process, right? You get sentenced to prison, it's not a gulag. You said the word prison. You didn't say the word concentration camp from Stalin or from Hitler. Okay, so then let's have that conversation. You can get visitors in a prison. Right? You got a release date, most of the people in there, right? There's some sort of process where you can petition when there are human rights violations. That happened famously here in the United States in the 60s and 70s during the riots in Attica. So you can't visit. There's no petitioning. There's no judiciary. There's no due process. It's not an open air prison. It's a concentration camp. And for the people that are upset because they think that evokes a different type of imagery, we're talking about the same concentration camp that Japanese people were interned in. However, now we see similarities between not just that, but we see similarities between a bombed out Warsaw ghetto and what we see in Gaza. And it's even worse in Gaza in this case for now, right? We don't want to see it metamorphosized into the type of genocides that we've seen in Europe and other places. So we're speaking up. Now, in terms of people that are diametrically opposed to this and are trying to use their influence to silence people, yes, that is coming from above. That's coming from people that are like, oh, well, if you don't have this opinion, then I don't want you on this show, or I don't want you to do this festival, or I don't want you to be part of my agency. Okay. Have I felt the effects of that? Sure. Yes. Have I lost a gig or lost an agent because maybe they thought this? I can't tell what's in people's hearts, but I can definitely tell that there's been, a shadow banning online. There are certain things that I haven't necessarily been invited to, but it's not because anyone says, oh, he's anti-Semitic or this or that. No, it's just because they don't want that perspective there. I think the difference is that when people have a conversation with me, they're not having a conversation with a fanatic. They're having a conversation with someone that actually wants to come to a conclusion and is willing to challenge his own beliefs. The main problem that I've discovered, Alan, in having a conversation with Zionists is that they typically only come away with two impressions of you. One, either that you're a bigot or that you're a very intelligent and very well-educated bigot, because they can't possibly imagine that their narrative has actually been challenged and that this may not actually be true. They're raised in an echo chamber. And even when they see other Jewish people, whether it be Orthodox Jews in New York, which is a huge growing community that is totally opposed to even the existence of the state of Israel, They have no idea how to deal with those people. So you see countless videos of Zionist protesters telling them you should be raped, we hate you, you belong in an oven, horrible things to these people. You're not really Jewish. Really? This guy, this ultra-Orthodox, you, a secular person who just supports murder because of a commercial from 1967, you're telling me you keep the law of the Torah more than this man, which is offensive. And now we're reaching kind of the era of projection, where if we project something upon you, then automatically we're sort of anticipating that we're going to be hit with the same sort of accusations. So, yeah, you beheaded 40 babies. Well, that's not really true, but we did kill a bunch of them in the incubators, and that's what is actually going on. So I'm not saying that there's not violence. I'm saying that the way that it's categorized is to be hyper-focused on one and to find every excuse possible to not condemn the other.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody that we both know, the artist Low-Key, he, for example, it's faced a lot of censure and criticism and pushback and flack for his pro-Palestine views. I know his song, one of his most well-known songs, Long Live Palestine, was taken off of YouTube after years and years of being on there, millions of views, become pretty much an anthem of the pro-Palestine movement. Any march I've been on or demonstration, that single is playing. Everyone seems to know the lyrics as well. They're all singing along to it. But it was taken off of YouTube. And interestingly, the head of YouTube Music is a guy called Lior Cohen, who has deep ties to Israel and indeed even Israeli paramilitary groups. For example, he more or less got rid of Professor Griff from Public Enemy because Griff was considered to be anti-Semitic. He was accused of deliberately obstructing the promotion and release of an album by Lupe Fiasco, another great artist known for his unwavering support of the Palestinian struggle. Mos Def famously got in trouble for calling him a tall Israeli who runs the rap industry, even though that's more or less true. There's another person very important in the world of hip hop, Russell Simmons, the founder of the iconic Def Jam record label, which kind of really ran hip hop in the late 80s, early 90s. Now, if you go to wikileaks.org and type in Russell Simmons' name, you'll see that there are emails that show that he was in group chats with other entertainment executives and even with IDF officers, like outreach people, discussing ways on how to combat BDS and promote Israel, specifically to the Black community. So, for instance, Russell Simmons said in these emails that simple messaging, and this is a direct quote, by the way, simple messaging from non-Jews, specifically from Muslims promoting peace and Israel's right to exist. We have the resources and the desire to win rather than lose the hearts of young Muslims and Jews. And he also said that we've got hundreds of collaboration programs between imams, rabbis, and their congregations. We have many respected imams who would join former Chief Rabbi Metzger, Rabbi Schneider, and non-Jews in promoting the Saudi peace plan. And if people are interested in that, they can check out my investigation. It's called The Israel Files. WikiLeaks docs show top Hollywood producers working with Israel to defend its war crimes.
I mean, what you're telling me isn't surprising, because I think that a lot of people have been asking why certain artists aren't speaking out. You know, I'm not going to name names, but even artists that are Palestinian, how come they're not speaking out? Are their families under attack? Maybe it's this, maybe it's that. And what's been exposed is that a lot of them get all of their income from influencing, from sponsorships, and that it has caused a situation where they're sort of addicted to these sponsorships. Their entire livelihood comes from that. And without that, their income would disappear. And therefore, the life that they've built would begin to collapse around the economic reality of what they have now. And this is what we determinedly call a sellout. Someone that says, okay, well, I know this is wrong. I know that this is, morally bankrupt, but I'm going to be a part of it anyway. I don't know the details behind the Russell Simmons issue, because I actually haven't read that yet, but I'm going to look it up definitely after we get off. But I would say that I feel bad that some of these imams were probably lied to, and the people that were being in these situations probably weren't even told what they were a part of, which is why I'm very careful and very selective about who I decide to be around and what charities I'm going to support, because at the same time, one of them could be, being manipulated and used. I'm getting invited to a peace summit, and all of a sudden, at the peace summit, they're discussing how we can dismantle, opposing views to Israel. The point is not to dismantle opposing views, but ask if those opposing views are rooted in fact. Was there ethnic cleansing? Is there ethnic cleansing? If you want to point to Hamas in the Gaza, then what about how people are treated in the West Bank where there is no Hamas? And I think that they haven't had a credible response to that. There's a much passed around clip that's interesting that kind of matches or mirrors what you were saying. And it's about an Israeli spokesperson who comes in and is speaking to like a collection of like a Black Jewish conference, I believe, and says, one of the major problems that Israel has is actually with like young African American youth that aren't buying into the story of Israel. And to be honest, they see the comparison of it being like apartheid on one end, but now more people are comparing it to kind of like a Confederate South, where look what the settlers can do. They can hit you. They can attack you. They can violate you. They can do anything they want, similar to how white people could do anything to Black people in the Confederate South. And if you raised a hand to a white person, or you looked at them, or you whistled at them, you would be lynched. And so we're living in an era where the youth of the United States is now kind of fervorously rebelling against the idea of this peaceful Zionist entity that's being attacked by all these evil people. And then they're asking, well, how come these bodies, when you find them, are missing vital organs like corneas and pancreases and livers? And, that's a whole nother Pandora's box to open. But I think that as more and more people do research about it, they're becoming more and more fed up with a narrative. And if there's one thing about young people, and especially young people in hip hop, they don't like being fed a lie. And when they find out that they're being lied to, they don't just get angry. They want to expose you. And I believe that's what's happening right now.
Yeah, I guess these things are all interconnected, right? So we see that this is like a world system. It's this sort of imperialism that people in the Middle East or West Asia more generally feel, the guns, the bombs, drones, etc. These huge outbursts of violence, which are necessary to maintain capitalism, to expand the empire, are actually often brought home to the United States. So very often the tactics of repression that have been honed in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and on the people of Palestine are actually brought back into American communities, usually communities of color, usually poor communities. And they're actually used against the very citizens who they're, these police and these militarized police are sworn to protect. So we're kind of seeing like the sort of squaring of the circle here, where where the empire is really focusing its energy on back at home, right? And secondly, I would just say that, like, I don't know the music industry too well, but certainly the journalism industry is facing a similar thing where journalists are very, very worried to actually tweet out or say anything or go to some sort of demonstration in support of Palestine, lest it be used against them. Journalists generally have very precarious incomes. It's not easy to get like a fixed contract. And we've just seen waves of firings for people for statements they've made years and years ago, saying very milquetoast things, the sort of things that appear in United Nations documents or Amnesty International reports. But yeah, we see journalists all over the place, particularly very often if they're Arab or Muslim journalists, getting fired, sacked, and just generally thrown under the bus right now. And that's really a message to other people in the industry, right? You only need to do it once or twice and everyone else gets the message. You can't touch this. This is a live wire industry. But for someone like you who's been independent throughout their career, I mean, I guess that makes it much easier for you to speak out on these issues. How hard is it to be pro-Palestine in the music industry if you're not in a position like yourself?
I think if you just are pro-Palestine and you don't have like a plethora of knowledge about it and you haven't do years of research, then it's pretty hard because you're going to be challenged constantly by people that are going to come up with gotcha questions or, oh, do you condemn this or condemn that? And I'll say, hey, listen, I condemn all civilian death. Are you willing to do the same and join me in that? Because if that's the case, then you have some condemnations of your own to do. I think that some people immediately get afraid of having these confrontations because they automatically think they're going to lead to an even bigger confrontation, whereas I'm looking for a resolution. But to your point, yes, it is easier for me because I don't have a major label that owns me that can say, hey, turn his microphone off, right? The only thing that affects me is the algorithm of shadow banning and the other ideas that they have to say, oh man, maybe we don't want him on this festival or don't want him here. But in terms of me personally, no, I've been able to defend my position extensively within the hip hop community, and therefore I don't have a problem doing it. You know what I mean? Like if someone wants to argue with me, the first thing that I do is say, hey, sure, we can do something private. And by that, I mean that I'll meet with someone, and I'll be quite frank with you. I'm not going to name names, but I did meet with someone who was in was a prominent Zionist on Twitter. And he's just like, man, I grew up loving your music, and I really wanted to talk with you about this. This was like years ago. And I said, okay, dude, I'll tell you what. No cameras, no phones, no media. We'll just do this in private. And we met at a restaurant, right? And let me tell you something. I got something out of him that I don't think we get out of people very often. I said, listen, I want you to admit something to me, that anti-Zionism is not the same thing as anti-Semitism. Do you think that's true? Because the person that I've seen, tons of people who are anti-Zionist and they're Jewish. So are they anti-Semitic? And the guy got really quiet and he said to me, I will never admit this in public. But you're right. And it's just unfortunately because we see that issue too conflagrated now to tell the difference from it. So sometimes it's nice to have a quiet fight in private. I don't need to go on YouTube to give you guys views. Do you want to meet me? We can meet at 3:00 after school and I can beat the shit out of you in private. I don't need to go on, excuse my language, I don't need to go on your show and give you views. That's a privilege that I extend to people who I want to have a conversation with, like you, not someone who I think is just a purposeless antagonist and a propagandist. But again, I hand out beatings in private. I don't go for sensationalism. So if someone wants to talk to me about something, they're more, and by beatings, I don't mean like I'm going to hurt you, I'm just you're going to get a verbal lashing. And not a screaming match, but a slow walking down, like a prime George Foreman. We're going to stalk you. Every point, everything you say, we have a response for. And I'm willing to concede points that you may not think I'm willing to concede in the interest of moving the discussion ahead. But the difference is that I think in my position as an artist that was signed to an independent label, and even more independent now because I'm signed to nobody but myself, or it wasn't even signed, but I had a partnership with another label. And now it's like, it's just me. It's just Immortal Technique, Rebel Army Records. It's even more of the ability to speak freely, but also now I'm responsible for everything that I have to say. I don't have PR people that are going to argue for me. It's just the fans. You know what I mean? I don't have two publicists anymore, so they can't get up there and correct every single tweet that says something that's visceral or liable or slander. But I think that, in the case of how all of this proceeds, I've been fortunate to be able to express my position and to have, the ability to move in a space where I am independent, and therefore there is no one that can say, shut his lights off, turn his microphone off. I think that's what happens when you get into the mainstream. You agree to be part of a world in which someone can turn your microphone off, as opposed to independence and then coming into the mainstream. That's different. You've already come with your own fan base. The fan base is yours. It doesn't belong to your distributor or your record label. So even if I had a distributor like Interscope or Def Jam or a major label, then what would be the difference? I would bring my fans to that place. And if I left, I would leave with all my fans. My fans don't care about the label. Let me explain. The fans don't give a shit about the label. They don't care about the distributor. They care about me. That's the difference. Some other hip hop fans, they're anything that this label puts out, I love, or anything. So it's not really the artist that they care about. It's just one specific single. They're not emotionally invested. And I think the way that I've cultivated the fan base, they know that I'm not just going to pull something out of my ass and say it. I'm going to research it. I'm going to think about it. And if I happen to be mistaken in any way, shape, or form, I'm more than willing to fix it instead of just pretend that other people are lying the way we see with other individuals.
Do you think the rap scene is much different from other areas of the entertainment industry then? It sometimes seems like more rappers see the connections between imperialism abroad and injustices at home, like what I was speaking about before. Maybe there's this long tradition within hip hop of like politically conscious rappers really being some of the driving force and some of the most respected artists in the industry, from, as I've mentioned before, Public Enemy or KRS-One or Tupac or whomever. Do you think the rap industry is any different to other forms of entertainment in that way?
I'm not as fully aware of other forms of entertainment, but I would say that is it harder to be a hip hop artist than to be like a country music singer that supports Palestine? But it's probably harder to be a country music singer. Like if you the more demographic that we get, I think there's definitely more rebellion associated with hip hop. So it makes more sense that a person would rap about something that's against the system, against the narrative. But in terms of other forms of music, I don't know what that the music industry is still controlled by the same people. If they don't want you saying anything in hip hop, they're not going to want you strumming a guitar about it on America's Got Talent. So it doesn't really matter the venue. I think it matters more that the parent company is what owns all of these things. So the labels that we see that are major labels, even they're subsidiaries of a gigantic, like a massive mega corporation that owns most of the labels. So I think that it doesn't matter what music you make. If you start talking about this, yeah, you're going to find repercussions. It doesn't matter whether it's from hip hop. I think the difference in hip hop is that that sort of mentality is already set up to absorb that kind of message because it goes against the grain. Because we were told, oh man, we're supposed to question everything. And in hip hop, I became famous because people called me a conspiracy theorist. And what were my conspiracies, Alan? What were my conspiracies from Revolutionary Volume 2? I'll tell you three of them, three of the main conspiracies. One conspiracy was that the Iraq War was based on lies. How about that? And they said, oh, Technique, what are you talking about? Then I said, hey, you know what? The government is tapping your phone and reading all of your emails. And people in the comments in 2003 said, oh, this guy's a nut. This is preposterous. And only a couple of years later, we found out that that was actually 100% true. And then I said, you know what? Why I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't have a theory about 9/11. I don't think that they put control. I'm not saying that, oh, there was a tactical nuke, controlled explosives. All I said was, I don't believe the government's version. And when I've talked to mainstream media about that, they said, oh, so you're like a 9/11 truther or a denier. I said, no, I know the government lied, and I'll tell you why. Because my brother and a bunch of good friends of mine, they went to become United States Marines. They went to Iraq and Afghanistan. But before that, they were stationed down in the World Trade Center. They were guarding that area because the southern part of Manhattan after 9/11 was a militarized zone. You couldn't go down there if you didn't live there or if you weren't part of the military. It was blocked off everywhere, fucking Humvees. You know, some shit that you would see in like Northern Ireland during the Troubles. It looked like that, a checkpoint everywhere. And those people developed horrific respiratory illnesses. And the EPA and our government told us the air was safe to breathe. So they lied about the air and they killed their own people in the process of doing it to get people back to work. So if they lied about something as simple as the air to breathe, what else could they fundamentally be lying about? Then there's a name that keeps popping up, Tim Osmond. Now, you and I both know who Timmy Osmond really is, but the American public had no idea that Tim Osmond was the code name for Osama bin Laden. Why was he working for us? These are questions that we never asked on 9/11 because people were so terrified to have a conversation about them. But now I think because hip hop has come such a long way and we've crushed so many fake narratives, people are unafraid of speaking their truth. And sure, there will always be backlash because I explained to people freedom of speech isn't freedom of consequence, you know? Like I think that whenever you say something, you have to be prepared to deal with the consequences, right? And also I remind people that criticize freedom of speech or are for it 100%. Freedom of speech doesn't cover everything. You know, I'm not allowed to threaten someone else's life. That's a crime. I'm not allowed to libel or slander a person. I can't yell fire in a crowded theater and cause a riot. Those things aren't protected by the freedom of speech. And I think that, excuse me, in the United States, as it were be. But I think that what we see are encroaching areas where people are encroaching on the language rather than just you can't say this. So now the United States recently had a vote in Congress where they've set up a huge fund to deliver Israel, but also within the language of this amendment is the idea that anti-Zionism should be equated with anti-Semitism. And this is how they curtail freedom of speech, by not directly going after the people speaking, but saying, hey, let us edit out your words so you can't really say what you want to say without having to change the message to obscure it enough to not be illegal, but yet get your point across to people.
That begs the question, what you've been talking about being independent. Would you suggest to artists on the way up trying to pursue that independent path? Is that what you say, or is that too hard a path for some people?
I would say that you should base it on what you think you're capable of, right? I know a lot of different artists, and each of them is a different human being unto themselves. Some of them were built to be independent. They love going to the post office twice a week and delivering T-shirts and doing all that and doing the same thing I do, pressing up stuff, sending it here, getting everything done themselves. And then there are people that have other lists of responsibilities that they have in life, so they can't do that. And so they want to be with a major label that's going to take care of this or take care of that. It's really dependent on what you want. I would tell young artists that there's no such thing as a standard deal, that's the biggest lie that you'll ever be told. This is a standard deal. No, you get what you can negotiate. You get the best thing that you can negotiate. But again, you have to come from a place of reality. And I think that a lot of artists in the 80s and 90s, when they were asking for shows, weren't coming from a place from reality because they weren't actually used to dealing with real numbers. They were dealing with people that was washing money. So the only reason you're getting $60,000 to do a show in 1,000 cap club and the entry is $25,000, well, of course, how else would a person wash money? Because you get all this paper and they have a legitimate business. Don't you know how crime works? But now you're in a position where it's like, okay, well, everything is modernized and it has to be tangible for the Fed. So even an individual that's selling merchandise, they're counting how many shirts you press. So, I mean, I would tell the people in the independent world, it's really dependent on what you want to be, what kind of artist you want to be, right? You want to be a major pop artist, it's going to be harder to come from an independent world to be able to do that. However, I tell people, hey, man, if you take the stairs and you fall down, you only fall down a flight. But if you take the elevator and the cable snaps, you're going to the bottom, motherfucker. You hear me? And that's the difference between independence and being in the mainstream. I have my own fan base. If I fall down the stairs, Alan, I'm falling down, hey, maybe a flight. I got to dust myself off. But if I got on the major label scene so I could make my career, I would have taken the elevator all the way up. And the moment I didn't say nothing, they would have clipped the cord and I would have fell all the way back down. Then I would have had to rebuild an independent fan base by myself. And I think that because I never went through that and I had the experience of being an independent artist and building my own fan base and being in touch with people that support me, not just for who I am, but for what I say, it makes the complete difference in an independent artist.
We're speaking with legendary hip-hop artist Immortal Technique. Tech, I've got one last question for you, and it actually comes from fellow rapper Loki. He said, what was the hardest track to write on an emotional level for you?
I have a song called Caught in a Hustle. Um, I still get fucked up thinking about it now. My little cousin died when he was a baby. And I was angry because he was born with a hole in his heart. And the doctors refused to operate because they were scared that they would get sued. Not because they didn't think they would be successful. There was a chance it would be successful. But they opted not to do the surgery because they were scared of the financial, even though we would sign whatever waiver, whatever. So that's why I say in the beginning, I was born with an obstacle, with a hole in my heart as an obstacle, left to die by the doctors in the children's hospital. But I never lose hope. Success is psychological. The world is volatile, and the street is my education, shaping the nation like the blueprint of a mason. So literally, I had the first line, and even though it was one of the most emotionally difficult records to write, I wrote that song in one day, and I just cried after I finished it. And I just sat there thinking about what kind of life I had had and what kind of life my little cousin would never have because someone got into a job that they weren't really prepared to do. And I thought to myself, how many other people probably don't have the opportunity to have a life for the same reason? And how many people die when they're so young and they don't have the capacity to show the world what they're really capable of? And it reminded me of something that I heard in Afghanistan. And I guess since it's the last question, I'll leave you with a story. I went to Afghanistan in 2009 to build an orphanage for the people there. And while I was there, I was interviewing people, and I was at Kabul University, and I met this tiny little professor. And this guy's like 5'2". He's really skinny. He spoke with a lisp. His nails were manicured. I'm ashamed to say that I judged this man. I'll be honest with you, Alan. I judged him. I was like, who's this little effeminate dude? You the professor? He's like, yeah. You was in the Mujahideen? And he said, yeah. And so my whole attitude changed. And I said, what happened? How old were you when this happened? And he said, it happened when I was 14 years old. I was put into a RPG group. An RPG group means that you and two other people, usually or one other person, goes. And my job was to carry the RPGs. I have to carry them with little packs of ice, make sure it doesn't melt through there, and also maybe put in like Coca-Cola cans that have been left in the freezer or some shit. And so the stuff wouldn't overheat. And that way, whenever he shoots, I reload and he fires on the Russian positions. And I said, oh my God. I said, that sounds harrowing. And he said, yeah, my shooter is the permanent shooter until he dies, and then I would take over. I said, so did he live? And the professor told me, yes, he lived for most of the war, except the last year. But by that time, I had learned to use the RPG, and I already knew how to do it. And I said, well, what was the price of freedom? And he said, the price of freedom is an entire generation of people. An entire generation, meaning an entire generation of actors, of writers, of journalists, of doctors, of lawyers, of comedians, of bus drivers, right? An entire generation of every single occupation that you'll see when you go out your door, right? An entire generation of pilots, inventors, engineers, scientists, everything. That's what we gave up for our freedom. 950,000 of us died so that we could inflict harm on the Russian army to the amount of a little bit less than 20,000, but it was enough for them to leave. And he said, that's the real price of revolution. You give up a whole generation of your people. You watch a whole generation of children die. He said, that's what freedom is. That's the only way you can win it, because freedom can never be given to you. So I'll end by saying this, that it is my honor and my pleasure, and I consider it the greatest honor, that if these people are going to be smeared, I'll be smeared with them. If they're going to be attacked, I'll stand between them and the people attacking them. I have no fear of that because I know I'm on the right side of history. And I appreciate Mr. Loki's question, and I appreciate your questions. Just letting people know that we are going to be planning something very big to help the people of Gaza very soon. And as soon as that becomes more tangible, I will definitely let you know. And I'll look forward to coming back on the show and letting people know what we're up to. I appreciate your time, sir.
Well, I appreciate your time as well. And hopefully it won't take another generation of lost Palestinians for that group to be free one day.
Hopefully. Inshallah.
All right, we've been speaking with legendary rapper and activist Immortal Technique. If you like what you'd heard, please do subscribe to us on any platform that you're on. You can also support us at Patreon, patreon.com/MintPressNews. Until next week, I'm Alan McLeod. Stay fresh.
Peace.